All right. Just give a few minutes here for people to join. We'll get started in about 5, 6 minutes or so. Waiting for folks to hop on here. Anybody else on? If so, just type in the chat window if you will. Oh, it doesn't look like anybody else is on currently, but if you are, just send me a quick note in the chat. Let's see here. Nobody's on yet. Hey, Christian. Good to have you in here. I'll be starting here in a few minutes or so. Hoping to get a few more people. If you can hear me, just type into the chat room if you would, just so I know that folks can hear me. I take that as a yes. The random emoticon face. All right. All right. So I'll just wait for hopefully a few more people will show up here, and then we'll get going. And if not, then we'll just go anyway. Okay, it should have switched. Let's see. I'll go ahead and get started here. It should refresh my screen here in a minute. Let's see. Live coding is a little kind of laggy, so just bear with me here for a moment. Still on the screen. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. So just a real quick demo, or a real quick introduction rather. There's only Christians on here, but for those that are going to watch the recorded version, hopefully. My name is James Lothry. I'm a Salesforce MVP based in Rochester, Minnesota. And lately I've been doing lots of Lightning component development, specifically with communities. And so I thought I would kind of give some of my tips and tricks for developing those Lightning components. Early in the week, there was a webinar from Kartik and I believe a guy named David Green. And if you look at this website, so it was put on by the Salesforce developers group as well, and it's already been recorded and posted up there as well. So if you want to, go check that out before or after you watch this recording. There's a lot of good material in there from a getting started perspective. So information on how to set up Community Builder, how to kind of do some basic branding within Community Builder, and then also kind of just a bare bones drag and drop kind of component talk as well, and a little bit of customized branding. So it really kind of starts to dig into the development of communities a little bit. But what I want to do is kind of take that and start where he left off with, where Kartik left off on Wednesday with kind of the template stuff, and kind of show you some tips and tricks on more the nitty gritty component development piece. All right. So I'm just checking here. I have a GitHub URL. It should be showing up at the bottom. It might be not be because of the background. Let's see if I can fix that. Okay. We'll see if that fixes. But my GitHub URL is github.com/Dancin Llama, so DANCINLLAMA, and then /live code. So if you want, that's where I will be storing the source control from today's live coding. And then as well as there's a couple of helpful links I've found out through just kind of general development of Lightning components, and I've posted those here as well, including the webinar from last Wednesday. So those are all there in the README. So again, that's on my GitHub repo /live code. All right. So getting started. Let's see if anybody else has joined here. Real quick. Nope, just Christian and I so far. All right. So getting started, I'm going to jump into the Salesforce org. So right now I have just basically spun up a developer org and turned on communities. So it's really a simple checkbox that you hit enable communities. And then I've created my own community called Live Coding. And I haven't done a whole lot with it yet, right? I haven't branded it a whole lot. I've kind of left it bare bones, and that's kind of where we're going to take it and run with it today. So within the current release, which this release or this org is on spring 17, so summer 17 hasn't hit the developer orgs yet, so this is on kind of the current last release, so to speak. You have this community workspaces link down here. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into this. And the reason I mentioned the release is because Community Builder in Communities has changed a lot over the past few releases. And so it's constantly evolving, and I think they've added a couple links to that page in there. So when I click on Community Workspaces, hopefully, let's see. Making sure my feed is staying up to date here. There we go. All right. So my feed keeps cutting out like every 5 seconds or so. But when I open up Community Workspaces, I have a couple different options here. The main two that I'm really concerned with for this demo are the Community Builder, so the builder up in the top left here, and then as well as the administration piece. So on the bottom right here, there's an administration button or whatever as well. The administration piece, Kartik talked about this a little bit, but you can brand the login and registration pages. You set up stuff like where which profiles have access to the community and that kind of thing. And then the builder piece is where the kind of the fun starts for developers, essentially. So that's where the branding and Lightning component kind of development takes over. So I'm going to go hop in there. So Kartik talked about this a little bit on I think it was Wednesday, about the ability to kind of really fully brand the community. So this is based on the Napili template. It's also called the customer service template now, kind of a recent name change there. So let's see if it refreshes. So starting out, you get this kind of look and feel. You have a gray header with a kind of a profile icon or a profile component. And then you have this kind of annoying search bar, I would say, that a lot of people tend to ask to remove right away. And then you can also add a company logo over here on the left as well. Now, like I mentioned, lots of people want to remove the search bar, kind of customize this header bar here, just kind of as a first experience in the community. And then, so typically, it's kind of harder than it actually would be, or in the general sense. Most components, you can click on them and remove pretty easily, or hit an X to delete them from the component or whatever. Search bar is not one of those. So in the past, I would have to go and brand the URL by adding some custom CSS in here. So I would have to actually hide the div that the search bar is part of. Same thing with the profile and the company logo as well. But last release, I believe it was, Salesforce added this ability to add templates. And again, Kartik kind of touched on this a little bit as well already. I just kind of want to start there as a kind of component starting point. So one of my tricks, I guess, now that I just learned actually a week or two ago is using templates. Actually, they're called themes, sorry, themes in communities. So I'm going to hit theme up here. And then by default, I have this custom, I have a customer service theme, but I've also added a live coding theme called live coding template. That's actually just another Lightning component underneath the covers. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. Don't have to really worry about this. And then I'm just going to exit out of here. And then boom, it looks a lot different, right? So that is, in a nutshell, how you can customize the community and get rid of that search bar. Now, it kind of seems like a small, I haven't done a whole lot with the theme itself yet, obviously, because I'm just setting this up for a live coding demo. But if you think about it, it really opens the door for some really customizable content. In a sense, I can add like picture or videos to a background and make it really dynamic. I can move this header bar down below. I can move content around. I can really style it. If I'm a CSS expert, which I personally am not, I could really take the community and run with it and kind of do my own content. I'll show you how that works here in a minute. I just kind of want to show how the theme can change pretty easily. All right. So the way I did the theme, open up my Maven's Mate here. So I'm going to go open up Maven's Mate. It's a Sublime Text 3 plugin that I have. If you're not familiar, Maven's Mate is a community-driven effort for Salesforce development. And this particular release I'm using, I think it's Maven's Mate version 7, it's Lightning component compatible, so I can develop Lightning components. Oh, here, let me open my camera. Hey there. All right. So going back to Maven's Mate, sorry, I keep going back. So live coding template is actually a Lightning component itself, right? So it's defined as an Aura bundle, and those Aura bundles are stored in this Aura source directory by default. So if you haven't done any sort of Lightning component development, you'll find that your Lightning components are actually called bundles, and it's a bundle of like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 files, and they're all stored within the Aura directory. So the live coding template bundle has a component and a CSS attribute or a CSS file associated with it, and it also has a couple of different JavaScript files attached to it as well. So the first one is the component, and this really dictates kind of the HTML markup of my template, and it's really super simple to set up. Basically, for the templates themselves, you have to implement a base component called force community :theme layout. And this basically tells the community builder that, hey, I have a theme available for you to choose from within that theme list that we just chose. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that they have standard attributes that you can define in your theme components, and those are all kind of documented within the, if you Google for Force Community Theme Layout, they're all within that particular attribute. So, for instance, I have a nav bar, profile menu, I have a search variable, and a new header. These are all Aura component types, right? So I can tell the theme essentially, hey, stick this lightning component, whether it's a standard or custom component, doesn't matter, within the nav bar value provider, what they call it. So I have a couple different divs here. Header content, logo and navigation, and then a profile menu as well. So I'm using these divs to kind of control the layout, and then I just plop in the standard variables, I guess, from the theme communities, and it just works, right? Essentially, it's kind of how the magic happens. So the v dot context is basically how you reference variables in Lightning. So that's why I see v.profile menu. So this div right here shows my llama picture within in my profile picker essentially as well. The v.body is actually the main body of the page that I'm displaying currently. So if I go back to the community page, the v.body is essentially this whole white space down here. And then within that body, Community Builder is smart enough to say, hey, you can have a headline component, you can have this featured topics and feeds component, and so on and so forth. So you're kind of defining a little bit on how the main kind of whole window of the Community Builder works, right, within my theme. But then I can still customize that body per page. So that's kind of my first tip or trick, is to use theme layouts for configuring your branding within your community. And to configure that branding even further, you can use the CSS component of your theme. So I can give my divs particular backgrounds, I can dictate how wide they are, so on and so forth. Now within this theme, I'm using actual hex code values here, right? I'm also kind of displaying particular widths and heights and stuff like that. And in a little bit, I'll show you how you can actually standardize that so your admins and stuff can configure those variables themselves using something called design tokens. So that'll be one of my other tips. I'll go over here in a second. All right, so let's see if anybody's joined to just curious. Nope. All right. So that in a nutshell is how you kind of define a theme. And next, I'm going to kind of show a bare bones component too that we're going to develop. All right. So one of the components I've done a lot lately is kind of a custom related list component. So I'm just going to go over how I would do that within a communities component. All right. So the first thing, actually, the very first thing is I'm going to create what's called an abstract component. Now, one of my kind of nitpicky things that I love to do while I'm coding is I want to keep my code as simple as possible, right? I want to apply the KISS principle, keep it stupidly simple, or keep it simple stupid, however you want to look at it. And the way I can do that is kind of using the Lightning component object-oriented principles. So components themselves kind of actually use object-oriented programming in a nutshell. I can extend an abstract Lightning component and inherit methods from a parent component essentially. So I'm going to show how that works, and that's going to be my second tip. So right now I've actually created a component already called Lightning Abstract. Live Coding Abstract. And it starts out as a blank component. Now, to make it an abstract component, and this abstract component will be used for all my Apex invocations that I do throughout the community, I'm going to go ahead and say extensible equals true and abstract equals true. So you can kind of do both interfaces and abstract components, but we're going to do an abstract component here today. So this is the first thing that I want to do. Now the second thing is when I extend this abstract component, nothing is going to show unless I bring in this standard variable called v.body. Trust me, I speak from experience there. So I'm going to go ahead and add in v.body to my abstract component. First, I'm going to check something, make sure my syntax is right here real quick. So I'm throwing all this source up on GitHub, and I'm just going to do a couple checks here. All right. Awesome. So, yeah, extensible, true, abstract equals true. And that kind of turns my component into a abstract component. Now, another thing that I want to mention about abstract components is that the controller JS really doesn't matter unless you're invoking methods from this component itself, right? So I could put in some sort of do init method in here and call the controller method, but I tend to not even put a controller.js file. Now, but instead, everything is, I'm trying to think of how to say this. So anything that extends my abstract component will actually inherit the helper methods, not the controller methods, just the helper methods. So one thing I want to do every time, so I use the abstract class quite a bit to do stuff like Apex invocations, like I mentioned. So I need to call out Apex quite often from Lightning components, as do most, if not all, developers that write Lightning components. So I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of different methods for calling actions and handling the callbacks. So I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit here and throw in some code that I've already written. All right. So by default, you start out with this kind of empty bracket within the helper.js file. So I'm just going to write over it and kind of show you what this does. All right. So the first thing is this handle action method. And this handle action method is a generic method for calling Apex actions. And basically the gist is I set up the action, I set up the parameters, I enqueue the action down here just like I would any normal call out action from a Lightning component, right? And then I'm also calling setting the callback. Now the trick here, so the trick here kind of starts with the action.setCallback. And the trick is I am passing in a callback parameter as the last parameter here, right? And before I even get to that point, though, I'm doing quite a few different things. First, I'm basically checking the state of the request back from Apex. So I have a Lightning response Apex class that I'll go over here in a little bit that I return back from all of my Apex methods that I use to call out from Lightning. So they all have that same kind of structure. So I'm basically checking the state to start, and if it's not a success, then I'm throwing an exception. So I check the variable state first, and if that's not a success, then it's actually going to be probably an internal server error that comes back. And then next, I check the return value object that's been sent. So this is a pseudo success, I'll call it. But there might be an Apex error that I'm showing underneath as well, kind of in a pretty print or a better to read format than an internal server error. So I'm also checking the state value or state attribute, I guess, on the variable that I'm getting back from the callback. And if that's not success, then I'm throwing another error. Okay, so I do kind of two different error checks there. Then as I'm scrolling down, I then try to parse a JSON response. So the same Lightning response class, and I'll try to show that here in a little bit. So the same Lightning response class returns a JSONified string. And if that's a string, or if it's an array of custom objects, or an array of Apex wrapper classes, I don't really care, as long as it's in a JSON format. So I'm getting that back and I'm parsing it out. Now, I could potentially have an exception that occurs with a poorly formatted JSON response as well, and that'll get handled in the try-catch statement here as well. Now, if everything is successful within the callback, then we finally get down to line 34 and 35 here, right? So what this does, it calls my successful callback. And I'm fetching the concrete component. So the concrete component would be a component that's extending live coding abstract. Not live coding abstract itself, which is an abstract component, but the concrete component. And then I'm using that to reference the callback. So in the when I call this handle action method from a different component, so my related list component that I'll be doing here in a minute, I'll actually be calling this callback method here, and then passing in the variables I need, including the concrete component, the return value itself, and then context around that component, which will help me call methods and stuff. So that's the main piece of this handle action method. Now, in the error scenario, I also have this handle error method that I can call from the abstract component, and the handle error method is kind of cool, I think, just because it returns a toast message. So this toast message is just a standard out-of-the-box Lightning event that's available for basically Lightning pages and communities as well. It's not available for something like a Visualforce page because the Lightning context isn't there, but for it works for like detail record pages and like Lightning Experience, that kind of thing, as well as communities. So this pops up a little red modal or red toast that says, hey, an error has occurred. All right, so that's basically it for an abstract component perspective. Now, let's go ahead and implement a related list. And I'm just going to check to see if anyone else is on here yet. Nope. All right. So let's go ahead and create a related list. So in Maven's Mate, I can just hit Command-Shift-P, which opens up the command palette, and then type in new Lightning component. And let's call this related list. And then I'm going to need a controller, a helper, a style, not documentation or not renderer. So, well, I could do documentation, but I'm just being lazy, right? So I'm going to hit create Lightning bundle up here. All right, so it's created it apparently, and then you'll see it in my list down here. And so by default, I get this blank or a component again. Now, by default, it's not going to show up in Community Builder, and the reason is it doesn't implement a certain base component. So I'm going to have to do a little digging here. I can never remember the exact text of the base component. So I'm going to open up the login form component here. Real quick, the login form component is basically a standard component that's auto-generated with the Napili template. So I'm going to go ahead and add in that base component. So once I do this, it should show up in the community. Granted, there's more work we have to do yet. So I'm going to go ahead and hit one more thing while I'm doing this. So we want to extend that live coding abstract component to inherit those helper methods, right? So I'm going to go ahead and select extends C:"live coding abstract. And the C: is very important here because that's my current namespace. So the standard namespace is C:, even if I'm not in a managed package context or anything like that, I'll still need that C colon. Now, if I were using a managed abstract component, so if I were, like, task array is one that I know of, right? So if I were extending a task array component, then I would have to have the task array namespace here instead of C. But there it goes. And then let's see, what else do I need to do here real quick? I think that's it. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit save. Let's see, I cannot extend non-extensible components. Let's see if I can save this guy first. All right, cool. So voila, bare bones component. And then I'm just going to show that it'll show up in the community builder now as well, or it should anyway. So I'm going to hit refresh on community builder. Maybe. Still thinking. All right, so community builder has popped up, and now if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, I'll see my custom component that I just created down here. So it's called related list. Yes, there is another related list, or a couple of them in there, but here is a custom component. And I could drag it and drop it onto the screen right now, but I'm going to go ahead and hold off on that just for now, because I have a few more things to add to it. So let's do that. So when I'm first developing something UI-ish related, right, I want to go ahead and, I'm not a CSS expert by any means. I'd say I'm above average in that department, but one thing that makes me look like a rock star, which I'm not, is going to the Lightning Design System and checking out how they do some things. So one of the first things I do, this is another tip, is to go to lightningdesignsystem.com. And then here I'm going to look for something that resembles what I'm looking for. Okay, so I kind of already know what I'm looking for. It's called a card. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the cards. You can use the quick search interface over here. So I don't want, they kind of just revamped this website like a few days ago, and it's pretty awesome. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, go do so. By default, this standard card here doesn't really do it for me, right? Because it doesn't look like any sort of related list at all. But there's variants on the right-hand side here, right? An example. So I'm going to go ahead and click the with data table, and this looks a lot better, in my opinion. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, but hey, wait a second. There's a Lightning card component. So one of my next tips actually is to use the Lightning tags. So if I search for Lightning card, there's already a Lightning Design System driven card layout component. And there should be a little thing over here. There we go, it's popping up. All right. So there's a little copy and paste icon on the top right of these code examples you can use, kind of similar to the developer boards if you're familiar with that. And I can just plop it right in here. So there's a few things here. There's also, now that's kind of the bare bones example, but if I want to choose an icon, I can actually give it an icon name as well. And so we're going to give it, we're going to do a standard contact. And then we want to make this, actually we want to make it generic. So I am going to add an attribute in here for and then I have to give it a type as well. All right, so using this one attribute, I've actually done quite a few different things here. One, I've defined a title attribute, yes, that I can reuse in my component. So I can, down here, I can go v.title, and then I'm going to do this as well to make it similar to that, and to make it similar to that example. So the title attribute actually can be exposed through the community builder as well, using what's called a design attribute or something like that. And I'm actually telling it to use a default of contacts. So when I bring this into community builder, contacts will show up there as the default. I could change that to whatever, but that's going to be my default text for that attribute. I can also make the attribute required. So like when I drag the component into community builder, it doesn't let me get away with not setting the attribute. And then I'm also going to add, let's see, so I'm going to make the default contact here, required equals true, type equals string, and then of course, let's see if I can do this here. Oops. Actually, we'll make the default empty array, and then give it a array of S objects. All right. Now, I'm defining kind of this list of records, and then I am, let's see, I'm going to try and save it here first. Oh, I see an error. Let's see, lightning card must be terminated by a matching lightning card. So I'm missing something here. Let's see if... I think it's that's kind of silly. It's a case sensitivity thing, I believe. Let's see. All right, yeah, case sensitive, nice. All right, so let's, what should we do here? So I'm extending the component, passing in the S-object name and records. So let's go ahead and do some programming. All right. Let's see here. This one's actually going to currently get all the records back, I believe. So let's go ahead and give it contacts and records, and then we will. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and search for doing it here real quick. That's not going to give me anything. LL Cool J doing it. Nice, nice, nice. All right. Be careful what you Google for, I guess is the story there. All right. So I have a couple different components that already do this, of course, but go ahead and copy this. All right. So plug this in. So I'm going to go ahead and create a doInit method. Now I want to pass it to a helper as well. And there's been a couple questions, I guess, in the developer community on what exactly constitutes logic in the controller versus logic in the helper. I tend to do just very simple, very, very simple stuff in the controller method if I do anything at all. So I'm talking stuff like toggle a CSS class to show a div or hide a div. Anything that's even slightly more complicated than that, if it's three lines or longer, or maybe sometimes 2 lines or longer, it's basically an automatic. Just ship it to the helper class, ship it to the helper file. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it that. Actually, I don't need an event for this case, so I'm just going to go ahead and pass the component. Control save. It allows me to save the JavaScript even though I haven't added anything to the helper. There's no sort of compile limitations there, which is kind of a little funky when you get used to it. So I'm going to do the same here. And then pass in a component. So initialize with stuff. All right. Now, eventually, I'll get to this in a minute, and I'll use the abstract class to call the apex and callback and all that stuff, right? But what I want to show you is my fifth tip now. Let's see. Sorry, message Christian. Would you say it makes any difference in practice to use SObject versus a pure SObject array? It might. So I'm just kind of getting back to your question that I saw here. Sorry. Probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference unless maybe once the force record preview, the force record stuff comes into play here in the next release or two, where you're passing SObjects back and forth. That might be a reason to use the qualified SObject kind of stuff. But yeah, generally speaking, I like to pass stuff back in the JSON kind of format, right? And so, there's really no caveat there I can think of. So, whatever works best for you, I guess, is what I would use for the SObject array. And what you're talking about is this parameter here for the records. So, apologize, I just saw your question there, and that's not really much of an answer, but that's my opinion, which is not much. All right, so going back to the helper method, I'm going to go ahead and add a debugger statement in here, and I'll want to take this out. I just kind of want to show a few things. So tip number 5 is on how to debug your component once you develop it, right? When I'm first starting out, I add these debugger statements in to know exactly what code's getting executed where, kind of thing, right? Because that can get kind of confusing when you start developing Lightning components. So I'm going to go ahead and I don't have my developer console open in Chrome yet, but we'll get there. I have to re-log into my develop org here, so one sec. You're welcome. All right. Refreshing. So once again, I'm just gonna add my related list component to the home page here. All right. So the card component comes up here. We haven't done much of anything to it yet. All right. Just have contacts and the record length, and then the card body and a footer. All right. So, and you can kind of tell the Community Builder does a good job of trying to brand everything, right? So I have this green button here that's basically populated from my branding that I've done already over here with the little pen, along with this little footer badge. You can tell it's kind of a pale greenish kind of color, and that too comes from the branding as well. So in the branding, I kind of define this green color scheme here, and it's pulling in from all that information, believe it or not. So I'm going to go ahead and preview. And preview doesn't do a whole lot, but kind of gets rid of all the component moving around stuff. That's essentially all it does. Now, I'm going to go ahead in Chrome, I'm going to open up Developer Tools. And this is that fourth tip, so I'm going to debug my component. And let's see, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh, or refresh the page. This is actually going to get out of the builder, or out of the preview rather, and come back into the builder. And opening up the developer tools is something that you can do as a published community. It's something that you can do in the builder if you really wanted to. It's something you could do in the preview. So it's not restricted to any of those. It should have hit. Should have hit my debug statement, but it's not. Anyway, let's see if we can do that. Let's see, controller. We'll add a debugger statement in here just for, and then we'll also save this. All right. Hey, we got another person. Welcome, Bacon Drinker. Bacon Drinker. Those are two of my favorite things as well. All right. Come on. Aha, so it hit it. Sometimes sliding components, I'll mention too, they take a while to kind of refresh on the server. Sometimes you'll have to refresh the page a couple of times in order to get your changes to stick. I've been noticing that with Community Builder over the past actual 2 days or 3 days. So I'm not sure if it's something new, but something to be mindful of. And then when the debugger statement hits, this is a JavaScript kind of functionality, not specific to Lightning components. But when the debugger statement hits, I can use the console to kind of investigate my JavaScript stuff at the time being, right? So I can hit component here, and then, let's see. Then you can see the variables within that component, which is kind of cool. I can also do something like component.get v.title to kind of get the attribute at the time that the code is executing. And so this really helps you out quite a bit, or helps me out a lot for stuff like debugging. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button, which will break out of that debugger statement. So that's debugging, and that's like tip number 4, I believe. All right, so I'm going to go back into here, into Maven's Mate, and start doing some stuff. So we're extending a live coding abstract component, right? And I talked about that quite a bit. So I can actually call a method here by saying this.handle call action. And what this does, it kind of goes up the tree. So it will hit that live coding abstract and call live coding abstract helper.this.handle action. So let's keep that in mind. I'm going to comment that out for now. But first we have to actually write the Apex code that's going to handle all this stuff, right? So I'm going to hit Command-Shift-P again. I'm going to create 2 Apex classes. It's not an Apex class. There you go. All right. So the first Apex class I'm going to create is a Lightning response type. And this is one of my favorite things to do lately. I don't know if it's really best practice per se, but it works. So I'm sticking with it for now. I know Christian, who's on the chat right now, has run into some issues with this as well in the past with JSON stuff being too large. So use this at your caution, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create this class. And it's going to be a very simple class. You can put some comments up at the top. Let's see. Let's call it just a generic Lightning response. And then we're not going to do with sharing. I don't really care about with sharing right now. But let's create a couple member variables. So the first variable I want to do is just a string. It's going to be the JSON response. Simple as that. Second one is going to be an error. Third one, state. And then I think these ought to be OR enabled as well. So when you want a variable returned from Apex to your Lightning component, you want to make sure that it is OR enabled. So go ahead and add those in. Public. So this is going to be my default constructor. We're going to make the default state actually success. Excuse me. And then okay. And then I'm actually going to create another one as well. And this one's going to take in an exception. And I'll kind of show that here in a minute. But all I'm going to do here is a few things. One, I want to debug any sort of exceptions I come across. So I'm going to do this. Then I can also even print out the stack trace. So there's two things there. And then, so this just goes to the debug log. We're not actually recording it to a custom object or anything like that. So yeah, I got a question from Bacon Drinker. What language is this? So I'm developing in what's called Apex. And Apex is a Salesforce kind of proprietary sort of language. And you're right, it's very similar to Java and C#. And in fact, it was mimicked after Java. So this is kind of all based, or it's written on top of Oracle in Java, and it's going to be slightly different, but it has the same kind of functionality. So we're looking at stuff like for loops and while loops and kind of the object-oriented principles of Java and everything like that, but it's going to be Salesforce in Apex. So that's kind of what I'm writing in. Let's see here. So one of the things I'll mention about Apex too, in difference to Java, is in Java you can import packages and libraries and stuff like that, and you really can't do much of that with Apex. So it's all kind of on the server. It's kind of interesting and challenging at the same time. All right, so as part of this Lightning response constructor too, I have these exceptions that I'm logging, but you know, if I want to write them to the database or whatever, I could even do that. You could create a custom object record and write it to the object. Excuse me. But for now, we're just going to do that, and we're also going to set the error variable to message. All right, call it good. All right. So that's the class I'm going to use to return my Lightning component calls to Apex. Sorry. Save and save and save and saving. Let's see here. Did I? Might have done something goofy here. Oh, there we go. All right, cool. So I'm going to create another Apex class, and this one is actually going to be my controller class for my component. And let's see. Use the default template here that I have in Maven's Mate. And call it related list CTRL. So naming context or the way that we name classes is all kind of individual to any sort of Salesforce developer. It's kind of just pick one and go with it. What I like to do is similar to Visualforce. I like to basically use my component name and then CTRL for controller. And that's how I roll. And I'm going to hit create metadata. All right. So once again, I'm going to add some comments at the top here. So forth. All right. And then can I have some bare bones stuff in here. Lightning or enabled methods, they do respect sharing permissions, so that's important to note when you're using communities. You'd run into certain situations when you actually want to use without sharing, just in rare cases like dealing with some random accounts that you can't access, that kind of thing. But they do respect that with sharing keyword, so keep that in mind. When I call a Lightning component, or when I call Apex from a Lightning component, I need a or enabled, so that's the annotation method that's also static, right? So I need a static method that's or enabled. And then in addition to that, to use my abstract component that I wrote earlier, which is up here called live coding abstract, I'm also going to return that Lightning response type that I just created. So that's my tip number 6, I believe it is now, to return this all the time. So let's call this, we'll call it get records. And I'm just going to pass in the S object name. And let's see, do I want to do a filter? I'm just going to use this object name for now. All right. And all this is going to do is a dynamic sockle query. So, actually, you know what? I'm going to pass in some fields as well. All right. So what I'm going to do is construct a dynamic sockle query. Which looks vaguely something like this. And yes, this is probably not the safest thing to do because you can, pass in stuff right from a Lightning component, so you want some security around it. But for sake of demo purposes, I'm just going to leave it very simple here. And then, before that, sorry, I'm going to step back a little bit. So before that, I want to construct my Lightning response. So I'm going to hit response equals new Lightning response. And then as part of the kind of exception handling that's built into everything, right, I'm going to swallow this inside a try catch. This will actually be a query exception, so I'm going to go ahead and type that out. Let's go. I created that new constructor for just the exception case, so I'm going to go ahead and call that. And then return it. So pretty easy peasy. And then back into the query scenario, so I have this query that I have basically select fields from SObject, no filters or anything, dev.org, so I don't have that many records. I am just going to say list of SObject. Let's see. It's been a while since I've done a dynamic query here, but we'll see if this is the right syntax. So there's that, and then I'm going to JSON serialize it. And pass it into the Lightning response. So response.JSON response equals that. All right, that should work. course, the server's going really slow, so, or probably my router's bonking down right now, but we'll see how long it takes for this to save. So this method is pretty simple. All it does is it takes basically an S-object name, which is kind of a table if you're used to a standard database like MySQL or whatever, and then a list of fields to query from. So it's saved. And now I have a Apex controller. So I'm going to go back into my method here and specify that in my component. So you do that by adding controller equals and then the controller name at the top here. So a few things to kind of go back over. We're developing a Lightning component for communities. So we're implementing the Force community base record component. We are extending an abstract component that gives us access to a couple cool pieces of functionality. And then we're also using the related list Apex controller. All right. So let's see here. Back in the helper class, I started to kind of stub this out a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing is I want this handle action method. And I'm going to go back inside the handle action method here. So I'm just going to copy and paste this so I know the parameters to use. All right. Where are we? There we go. All right. So the first one is the component, which is easy. I just pass in component. The second one is parameters. And so I have two different parameters that I'm passing in. So I have S-object name, which I already have up here, and I have another one that I'll be passing in called fields. Or field string, I'm going to go with. All right. So I'm doing a contact example. So I'm going to pass in, let's see, let's go first name, last name, email. All right. Those are kind of standard fields on the contact record. And then again, I'm going to do string. All right. Let's see any other questions? Nope. All right. So back in my my helper method here, I'm going to pass in, let's see, this object name. And then to get a variable from your component, you do component.get v dot the attribute name, right? So v dot subject name, and then field string is going to be this. So component.get v dot field string. All right. So those two should come back, and then my third parameter is action name. So action name is a little different. It's not v dot; it's actually c dot. So my abstract component takes care of the component.get piece of this. So I'm just going to pass in c dot, what was it, get records. All right. Then next is the callback. So this is where the successful condition occurs, right? So let's create another function down here called handle record or handle get records callback. I guess tip number 7 from me, as I'm writing this out, is never name your Apex methods and your helper methods the same. Never ever do that. It results in infinite recursion, essentially, and is very bad. So, for instance, I never want to call my Apex method, which is that related list controller up here. I'll never want to call this doing it, because that causes stuff to blow the heck up. Alright, so I'm going to define my callback here. And in the callback is a little strange. Admittedly, it's my fault, right? So the callback is going to be, let's see, I want the component, the return value, and self. Alright. So I want component, return value, and the context. So I'm going to add another debugger statement in here, so I know that I hit it. And then once this comes back, I'm basically going to set the records variable that I have, the records attribute, to return value. And that's that. All right. So what this will do, on success of the callback, it'll basically return a list of contact records and set it into the v.records attribute, if it all works. All right. So I go back in here. I'm going through, looking. I don't have any sort of, I'm not looping through and displaying the records yet. So let's go ahead and take care of that. Let's look through. So I'm going back into the Lighten Design system here for a minute. And this is just the website that has the CSS in place. Excuse me. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy the HTML here. Hope it formats nicely enough. Let's see. And I want to add it in the body. So add it here. So I queried first name, I queried last name, and also email. Actually, I'm passing the field string, the field string dynamically, so I probably wouldn't do this, but for demo purposes, I am. Delete that guy. And then so at this point, actually, I want to iterate through the records I get back. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You do that by using the Aura iteration tag. So I'm going to pass in records as that. And then for lack of better thinking, I want to just pass in a var rec. I think that's right. We'll find out. All right. I'm going to take this row here. And this will be v, or no, there's no v-dite here because it's not a lighting component variable, it's a loop variable. So I'm just call rec.firstname. And it's important to note that this is mostly JavaScript based, so the variables themselves are case sensitive. So that's why it's capital F and no capital N. If it was a variable that, maybe a custom variable called firstname_c, and it was like that, it's still case sensitive. So it's something to keep in mind. All right, so there's that, and then we'll do last name. And email. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the last guy there. Okay, I don't like the indentation here, so I'm going to go ahead and re-indent. Hey, look at that. All right. So let's go ahead and try and save. All right. So it's time to test out our component in Community Builder here. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh Community Builder. Of course, I've already logged out again. I've been talking for that long, huh? All right. Come on, Community Builder. So I hit my debugger statement here. Let's see if we go to the next one. This .handle action is not a function. It is too. Is 2. Alright. So it's complaining that this guy is not a function for some silly reason. But he is. And should, so the issue here is that it's not finding the abstract method for some reason. I've done this before, so I'm not quite sure what's going on here, but let's try to figure that out. Alright. One thing I can do, so this is tip number 7, is to use Lightning Linter. So in my workspace here, I'm going to go ahead and into the live coding abstract. So Lightning Linter is a Heroku plugin. You can install it by installing the Heroku CLI, and then I think it's like plugins install Linter, maybe something like that. But there's instructions on it in my GitHub repo. So I am going to do Heroku Lightning Lint, I think is the right one. Let's see. All right. So first let's check this. And there's a debugger statement. Fine. Should be able to take that out, no problem. And okay, now if I go to the related list component, and let's try linting this guy. So I found one error. Aha! So this is probably where some of the issue is, I bet. So when you have errors, like random stupid errors in your Lightning components, the first thing that I do to check is to run this Lightning Linter. And it helps kind of point you in the direction of, hey dummy, you know, you did this at this line. So let's check out line 11 of related list. So line 11, aha, that'd be why. So I didn't Well, could be why anyway. So I didn't specify a callback. So let's do that. Handle get records callback. So I'm basically just saying use this function for my callback at this point, right? So I'm just saying when I run my Apex action and it's a successful action, then call this method, essentially. The parameters, so these three parameters here all get passed in via that abstract component magically. So that's how the abstract magic happens. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save. Christian, are you still on? Have you done anything with abstract components yet? And they're pretty useful, so just curious if you've done that or not. Anyway, so let's hit Community Builder again. All right, so I'm reaching my debugging point here. Let's step through it, hopefully. Cannot read property 0 of undefined. Okay. Awesome. All right. Good enough, Christian. Thanks. All right, so there's another issue with my component somewhere. Let's take a peek. Oh. Yeah, I agree. But at least it's there, right, Christian? At least we have it, that we can use it. Okay, I think it's, so in the past, my abstract component is read from a list of errors. So let's check that out instead of a string of errors. All right, so here, error encountered. So some other error was encountered. I'm just going to comment this out for now. And then let's also add in, so trying to figure out where exactly my component is kind of tricky sometimes, right? It could be in one of these folders over here, so it's just kind of tricky to find. So let's see if, usually under something with C in it, the standard workspace, but that's not what I'm looking for. Oh, let's see if I can find it in here. Alright, well I can't find my component for some reason. There's just so much stuff in here. Excuse me, but let's see if it comes up. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and add another debugger sim in here. All right. So I'm going to refresh again. I'll probably do this for another half an hour or so, and hopefully I can get something working by then and show you guys. Come on. All right, so we got a success, or we got a result anyway. And let's take a look at that. So result, type in result in console. All right, so here's the result object I got back. The error is unexpected token null. So I bet that is with the values I'm sending over. All right, so let's try it one more time. So you have to be pretty exact with what you send over from your component to Apex, otherwise it does stuff like that. So let's go ahead and take a close look here. So I have an attribute called field str, excuse me, and that looks good. And then my handle action method is passing two parameters, field str and a subject name. So far, so good. What I'm looking for is anything that looks kind of different than what I'm expecting in the Apex realm. So I'm going to open up my Apex class here, and this is probably why right here. So my parameters are different, right? I had field string instead of field str, so let's go ahead and fix that. Excuse me. And they also have to be the same exact case, I believe, too. So you have to be really exact between the parameters that you're passing into your Apex calls as opposed to actual parameters. Otherwise, it just treats them as null values. So it's saving. While that's saving, I'm going to go ahead and take a peek here. So let's open this up. So one thing I forgot to do is define a design attribute in my component, right? Otherwise, so I don't have any variables over here on the right-hand side that I can change. So what I'm going to do, that I forgot, let's see if I can open up the developer console here. Excuse me. That's not what I wanted. All right. So I'm logging back into Salesforce here and going to create that design component to my, I don't know what you're calling it, design attribute thing to my component. Oh, you know what? All right. I really could use a password manager, but I'm just too lazy to figure out which one I like. So come on. So the design attribute thing is actually something I can't do through Maven's Mate. It's one of the very few things I cannot do. So I actually have to do that through the developer console currently. It's possible that it's already been fixed in a later release of Maven's Mate, because I have a pretty old version, I believe. But currently I cannot do it through there. So I want to open up the developer console. And I'm going to open up my Lightning component that I've been working on here. So the design thing, I'll just call it the design thing. So I'm going to create that. So this is my component bundle on the right-hand side in developer console. I have the component, which is the kind of the markup, controller, which is JavaScript, helper, which is JavaScript, style, which is like the CSS design piece of everything. And then there's a documentation piece, a render piece, and then design piece. And who knows what the heck the SVG thing is. I don't think anybody ever uses that. But so the design piece actually tells you what you can configure through Community Builder or through a record page layout. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this object name. Actually, I'm going to not sure the exact syntax here, so I'm going to Google it real quick. Maybe this is it here. All right, so, yep, we got it. All right. So I basically have to kind of expose my variables through to the Community Builder. So that's what I'm doing here. Field stir. The weird thing is here, so for record ID, so for components that deal with records explicitly, individual records rather, you would define a record ID design attribute down here, and you'd actually pass in, you'd set the default of the aura attribute in the component to record ID. It's a little curmudgeon-y. So the way that works is it shows up as the default variable in Community Builder, and then Community Builder is smart enough to pass that record ID attribute onto your component. So you'd actually do that default piece in the Lightning component itself. And so I do a couple of defaults here for sObjectName and for field stir, and we'll see those show up in Community Builder, at least we should. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. All right, and then back in Community Builder, let me refresh it one more time. We should see some component properties show up for that related list component now. And that's like tip number 8, is to use those design attributes, because they're very handy. Let's see here. So I'm going to step through the debugger. Hey, I think we got some, hey, we got records back. Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. All right. Not quite what I was looking for, but we can work with it. All right. So, the component properties, right? So I'm going to click in here. So now that I've added that design attribute in, we see my defaults kind of pre-populating as properties, right? So theoretically, I'm not going to try it because I'm asking for trouble in that regard. But you could say account up here, and then it kind of refreshes the component. One sec. Blah, 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 blah. All right. So you can actually change your attributes up here as well. I'm going to switch that back to contact. And I should see 22 records come back there. Let's see. Yes. All right. So let's take a quick peek again. I'm trying to figure out why the first name and the last name aren't coming back. It's probably a case sensitivity issue that's going on there, but we'll see here in a second. Okay, I'm going to investigate the callback down here, so I'm going to put a breakpoint. Once again, this is the Chrome Developer Tools window here, and you can get to it by clicking the little ... icon, at least in my version, and going to More Tools and Developer Tools up here, and this opens up the JavaScript console and a few other things that are goodies for developers. And then in this console window, I can set breakpoints at will. That basically pause the execution, right? And then investigate, the state of the JavaScript stuff at that particular point. So it's a very handy thing. All right, so I got into the callback here. I'm going to look at the return value to see what that looks like. Good grief, this is slow. The streaming software is like bogging down my browser. All right, so yeah, as I suspected, so I have capital F and a lowercase n, so that's why my first name, last name is not coming back. So let's go ahead and take a peek at that. I'm going to go back to my component. So right here, I have first name, last name, email, and really all I want to do is change this value here. So I'm reading in from the field, and as I mentioned earlier, this is all kind of JavaScript based, and as a kind of a factor of that, it's case sensitive. So I have to change this to capital F, capital N. And because these are standard fields, that's not really something I can change, right? If it was a custom field, I could probably change it by refactoring, but I can't. So, all right. Oop, missed one. All right. So while that is saving, I want to show something else real quick, which is like one of my last tips of community development. And that is to utilize what's called design tokens. So design tokens are a CSS kind of variable that you can use throughout your components. And they bring in stuff like the color, the branding editor, and that kind of thing. So that's something that I've been waiting a long time for with communities, and I'm super stoked that it's finally here. It has been for a little while, but it's a very cool feature. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create a new design token. And this is, I guess, one other thing that I couldn't get to support with my Maven's Mate IDE. I don't think, anyway. I don't think I can create design tokens, but you do that by going into the developer console. Let's see here. Open Lightning resources, I believe. Maybe not. Let's go File, New, and then Lightning tokens down here. Now, you can create as many as you want, but there's only really one that I care about for the most part, and that's default. I think it's default tokens. Can't remember if it's singular or plural. Let's see. Let's check. So I mentioned at the very start of this demo that I have this GitHub repo, and it's github.com/dansonllama/livecode, and I have a couple different links in there. And one points to the community design tokens. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and hopefully it tells me what I need to save here. So I'm just going to do a control quick find for default. Standard design tokens, overriding standard design tokens, maybe. I'm striking out here. Let's see. Defining and using tokens. Let's try that. I'm just looking for the name of the default one here. Aha! So tokens created in the default tokens bundle are automatically available. All right. So let's go ahead and do that. So default tokens. Default tokens, yo. And it kind of boggles my mind a little bit that Salesforce doesn't just automatically create this for you, because it does a lot of stuff automatically for you. So I'm kind of, I've struggled with that a little bit, that they really should just create this default tokens bundle for us. But it is what it is. Default tokens, yo. All right. So by default, you don't really, it's kind of strange. You don't get the the standard design tokens. I actually have to extend a base component essentially, and let's see if that's in here. Standard design tokens, extending tokens bundles. I think this is it. Maybe. They don't make anything easy. All right. Overriding standard tokens. Is it? Something stupidly simple. Let's see. So I think, good grief. I might have to pause this and look at one of my my examples, but we'll check it out here. So back in Developer Console, I am going to say extends force base, and so we're extending the base set of tokens. So it's saved. Let's see if I'm able to use those or not. So back in my, let's take a quick look at that community thing, right? So standard design tokens for communities. So as this kind of shows, the design tokens for communities expose the various colors that you set in your branding editor in communities. And this wasn't really discussed on the webinar last Wednesday much, but I just kind of want to go over that. So all these tokens here on the right are available through that force base letting design token component thing. So that's what you get, essentially. And you can always extend or add on to that as well. So in my example, let's go back to my community builder. Maybe. All right. So in my example, let's see about this button here. Can I have much control over that guy? I do. So let's add, I think, we'll add a class called token test. Hopefully, let's see if that works. So all I did, I'm just adding a CSS class called token test to my button, right? And then in my CSS of my component, I can update that using the class selector called token test. So by default, I'd probably do something like, I want it to be a excuse me. I want it to be a solid green rather than a white button with green text. So I'm going to go ahead and basically do this here real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and say color white or FFFFFF, and then background dash color. And then I think it's 008000. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. So control save. And it should, knock on wood, update that button. Of course, it's Community Builder, so it's going slow. Now, with editing the CSS, I am essentially hard coding the color into the component, right? And I don't really, care to do that. I want to make it somewhat dynamic that an admin or someone configuring the community could come through the palette editor, through the branding editor, and actually define those colors for me, right? Because I'm not a designer. So that's where the design tokens come into play. And of course it didn't apply there. Yeah. Alright. So we have some CSS sleuthing to do here. Let's see real quick. So the way I debug this is I'm using Chrome again, and I right click on the element, and then unfortunately these are tricky here. So let's go ahead and inspect. So it has token test, but there's no did I not save the CSS file or something? Because it's not coming through. That's strange. Alright, let's take a quick peek. So in the related list at CSS, it should, let's see. Aha, I see my issue. Alright, so add token text instead of token test. My own fault. Alright, so like I said, we're hard coding colors into our CSS at this point, right? And so I want to be able to configure that for an admin to come in. And so for background color, I can use actually a token here. So I can say token, and then this is where those standard design tokens come into play. So I have basically a select number of things I can use. Color, border, background. I'm going to try this one. So I'm going to try color, background, button, brand. And I'm going to control copy it and use it in my code. So all you have to do is basically say token, parenthesis, and then the token name itself. And when it compiles-ish on the server, then it'll generate that color for me. Alright. So let's try this. It might complain. Nope, it didn't. Hooray. Let's try color too. These ones are kind of more finicky sometimes, just because it whines that you can't set certain CSS properties to some of these values here. So let's see. Color, brand. Let's try this one. I'm not quite sure what these will look like, so we'll just give it the old college try here. Alright, so this is token test. Color brand token cannot be used with the color property. Alright, so that's kind of what basically only certain tokens can be used with certain CSS attributes. So in this case, color brand can't be used with color for some reason I don't quite understand. So what I'm going to do actually is show you how you can do custom tokens instead. And so back in the developer console, I have this default tokens, and let's see if I can't quite remember the syntax again. So let's see here. Maybe it's defining and using tokens. All right, so I want to say, okay, fine. You're gonna play hardball with me. I want to play hardball with you. All right. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna define my own token, or a token, and I'm gonna call this color inverse, maybe. And then value is actually I'm gonna bring in that color brand. I really want to use that color brand, so I'm gonna bring in that standard token from communities. Let's see. It was not found on the tokens. It should be there. Maybe it's. Let's try C dot. There's a way to do this. Give me 1 second. Does this have a way of calling variables? Should be in there somewhere. Again, I'm having trouble remembering the exact syntax, but there should be a way to do it. Let's see. Let's see if a quick Google search will tell me. If not, then we'll just skip it over for now. But I've done it on other projects, so I know it works. Just a matter of... No, I don't see anything off the bat. So so somehow you can say v.colorBrand or v.standardDesignToken and pull it in. I just can't remember what the exact syntax is. So we're going to hard code it here for now. And that still allows a designer to come in and update my CSS for me, right? They're not digging through your Lightning component. So we'll call this color inverse. And save it. All right. Oh, shoot. We have questions here. Nope. All right. Yeah, so I mean, anyone have any questions so far? I have like 10 minutes left of this demo, and then I'm going to, kind of end it and maybe come back to it a little bit later. But 10 minutes left of the demo, and I'm just going to wrap up with the design tokens here and kind of show how that works. But there's a couple kind of wrapping up. So my really tips and tricks for communities Lightning Components developing is, one, I like to use abstract components to make that code generic for calling out to Apex. Two, I like to use the Lightning linter to debug stupid errors that I tend to make all the time. Three, I like to use the debugger statements when I'm developing in the console to kind of print that off. Basically debug my Lightning components there. Four really is design tokens. So what we're showing right now give the admins abilities to control your colors and CSS and all that stuff. And there's a couple others in there too, but those are really the main tips and tricks that I like to use. So let's see how that CSS looks. Aha, sweet. So now you see that the button in the contact related list here is green with white text, and it's really kind of simple. You might not think, whatever. You changed a color button. But what I'm doing here is I'm basically saying, hey, the admin can come in through the branding editor and pick and choose the color of that. So let's see. I think it's maybe the action color here. Let's try this. Let's make it an ugly purple. All right. Aha. So you'll notice that the action changed. So the ask a question button changed here. And then the new button color changed too. So I've kind of effectively shown that an admin can come in through the branding editor and change that color. And I can do the same thing for like the fill of this component over here. So this is actually an SVG icon that shows up. Excuse me. If I really wanted to, I could navigate down the CSS and change that color. I could change the font color, so on and so forth. So it's really a pretty powerful feature that's design tokens. So to wrap up, so communities is kind of a new. It's not really new, but it's becoming more and more popular through Lightning Builder and the popularity of Lightning components that have been kind of exploding. And really, you can do this all on your own if you wanted to. Play around with it, that is, by spinning up a developer org and then kind of going through various trailheads and that kind of thing. If you wanted to, I will be posting the examples that I've been working on. Some of them are already up there, but once again, I'm going to be posting those on my GitHub repository. So github.com/dansonllama/livecode. And then also on this repository here, I've provided a few different links. So if you haven't already, be sure to check out the Build Better Communities with Lightning webinar, except I misspelled lightning with lighting. Not an uncommon thing to do there. The Lightning design system is also very helpful. So that's how, basically the CSS behind communities right now and the Lightning experience and all that. We just went over community design tokens. We also went over the Heroku Lightning linter. So all those links are in my repository. Feel free to check those out. And then, more importantly, thanks everyone that's actually stuck on the call and watched me go over all these demos today. So I really appreciate you visiting my live coding stream, and have a great afternoon and a great weekend.